Welcome everyone, and I hope you can hear me. So Happy New Year's, if I haven't seen you since the big day. Oh, thank you very much for confirming you can hear me. And I hope that 2026 is going to be an absolutely lovely, smashing good year for you. And that things can improve. As I said before, though, often things get worse before they get better. So don't hold your hopes for samsara sorting itself out. We're going to try to whiz through these questions. We're kind of getting near to catching up. If you don't know how the system works, then what we have is a kind of spreadsheet that you can fill out, a form you can fill out to submit questions, and then I'll try to answer those questions as best as I can. I kind of fell behind, but I'm trying to catch up, go a bit more quickly these days. So here's a question from Uno from the United States, and it's, can you please talk about the natural state of mind and indications that you have seen it and are stabilizing it? So this is like the fundamental point about the highest level of Tibetan Buddhism associated with Mahamudra and Dzogchen. So the first thing you have to understand is that this is in no way simple. I mean, often what you hear is like, actually the problem is it's too simple. That's why we miss it. But that doesn't really help us out. So the true nature of mind is also synonymous with ultimate reality, ultimate meaning, true nature phenomena. And so essentially, that true nature is something that is present in every moment of awareness. So what we tend to do is we hear what's taught in the Dharma, and we hear that we need to find mind, we need to find the true nature of mind, the natural state, and so we go looking for something, because we're kind of very materialistic, and we objectivize everything. And then what we do is we go looking for something. And usually what that is we go looking for a special kind of experience, some kind of feeling. And so people will say, oh yeah, I went to my teacher and I asked him for pointing out instructions, and he tapped me on the back of the head, or he did something else. And I had this amazing, open, infinite experience of consciousness. That's the sort of thing people say. And it's because immediately what we've done when we've heard about this sort of true nature, we've heard about the Mahamudra Dzogchen, we've heard about luminosity, is we've fabricated something in our mind, an idea that there's something I need to find. And then, so it's ever present, right? But we don't see it, so what's going on there. And then when we sit in our meditation, we look for it, we're kind of trying to find something that's hiding in our mind, hiding an experience. And that's why it always goes wrong. And so in general, there's a process of kind of confirmation in the Zen tradition, although these are not synonymous. This true nature of mind is taught in Buddha Dharma in Tibet, and what's taught in as primordial awareness in the Zen tradition aren't the same type of meditation. That's what all the experts say. But it's similar in that we go looking for something, we objectivize and we go looking for something. So what we have is this kind of process of confirmation. So it's usually done with a teacher. So I can talk a little bit more about the actual process. And whether it's in Zen tradition or whether it's in Tibetan Buddhism, then it's guidance from a Zen master or a meditation master, right? And in Tibet it's called kind of mind instructions, or it's called the search for mind, the quest for mind, that sort of thing. Semjong, Semtri, mind guidance. And in the Zen tradition, and we're kind of more familiar with that, they use koans and various techniques. Not necessarily just koans, but that sort of thing. And what it is that you've got a master, right? This master has to have experiential knowledge of this type of meditation. And they also have to be quite clever at figuring out what the student's disposition is. And if the teacher has these two things, then they'll be able to steer us. And there's lots of different ways that a teacher steers the student. But they'll part of the problem is that this thing cannot be explained linguistically. And so you can't just tell somebody what to do, and you can't just say, oh, you've got it wrong, you have to do this instead. You can't give guidance in that way. You have to kind of work with that student's own assumptions. Now, in general, when this questioner asks, what are indications that you've seen it, then in general, this indicates the person hasn't seen it. But I won't say that's 100% the case, right? It's not 100% the case. It is possible. But in general, you won't have a kind of doubt about it. If you have recognized the true nature, the kind of feeling you'll have will be one of, oh, that's so stupid. Why didn't I notice that in the first place? And generally, if that's going well, if you really do have recognition, then even if your teacher says to you, no, you've got it wrong, you won't believe them. You'll think they're just saying that for another reason, like to reduce your pride or something. But there is something else which is called a lightning insight or sudden realization. And that's not the same as recognizing the true nature. And that's associated with experiences. So you'll have an experience and you'll think, oh, that was something significant. But that's always going to be veiled in a type of ignorance. So you're not going to quite know how it happened or how you got there. And you might be really in the dark about it. So, you know, in general, people who think they found something special in their mind have got it wrong. For example, they say, oh yeah, I saw a light or something like that. Or you have this feeling you've experienced or uncovered some special kind of consciousness. If you've got that kind of feeling, then it's not right. Also, if you have a feeling like some specific objective or special thing, you've got it totally wrong. So it's quite difficult to talk about this topic in general, because part of the process of coming to recognize the true nature is dependent upon the student kind of really, in an uninhibited way, expressing what they believe or feel. So, and that needs to be their mistakes initially. And so they will say something like, oh yeah, I was meditating, and then I saw the true nature, and the teacher will ask them about that. But they won't kind of lead them in any way. So when you see teachers who are teaching what they think to be the Mahamudra and the Dzogchen, but they got it wrong, then generally what they're trying to do is to lead the student, to tell them where it is, what it is, that sort of thing, or it's a special thing. And that usually sort of reveals or betrays the fact that they don't actually know what they're talking about. You know, and most people think it's a blessing. I made a video on this recently. And that's totally wrong. It's not just something that's zapped into your brain. And there's some teachers these days who are a bit better in this regard, because they don't think it's something that can be bestowed upon you. But they still basically identify it as something objective, like an experience or a feeling. Like recently I was listening to this one quite famous, I suppose he's a Western meditation teacher. I don't know if he's exactly a meditation teacher, but he was saying that, oh yeah, it was something that most people overlook, and in the lower schools, Theravada, they pass over this bit, but it's actually, that's the Mahamudra, the Dzogchen, and it's when you look at your mind, the first moment you look at your mind, there's this kind of experience, and you lose it very quickly. And if you can rest in that. And so it's kind of an indication that they've objectified an experience in their mind, and they kind of don't get the point. So if I talk a lot about what it is, like it's not an it, right? But if I talk a lot about what the true nature mind is, etc., then all that will happen, that will sabotage people in coming to realize it themselves. That's a really important point. You have to kind of realize your own mistakes. And because of that, then basically you need to do this with a teacher. I don't think there's any way to come to realize this on your own. Even Guru Rinpoche needed guidance to recognize the true nature. So if you want to know about this, then you have to find an authentic teacher. And then you have to really commit yourself. You know, I was kind of lucky because we had this Tibetan teacher from Eastern Tibet who's renowned, well, by everybody really, as being a really good meditation teacher. We kind of lucked out. The only reason why this was beneficial for me is because I took it really seriously, and I practiced like my head was on fire. Literally, I was just not sleeping because I wanted to understand the what he was getting at, or try to find out what the true nature was, or to answer the questions he was asking me. I was sitting there eating, meditating all day long and having no breaks and not sleeping at night hardly. And when I was eating, I was still trying to investigate, apply this sort of investigation that was part of this mind training thing. So you need to find an authentic teacher that you're sure about, have faith in them, and then you need to apply yourself like you've never applied yourself before. And so those are really difficult conditions to meet. But the first thing you need to do is do some homework and find an authentic teacher, and then start the process. But generally, it's only ever done in retreat, right? So most people think they can just follow some guy on YouTube, and then they know how to do the Mahamudra or Dzogchen. Like recently, I've had a lot of students who've contacted me and done one-to-ones, and most of them say it must be a new trend, because I'm hearing it a lot recently. And they're saying, oh yeah, well, I've been doing all these different types of practice, but I really like Dzogchen and Mahamudra the best. And then I'm like, oh, okay, what do you mean by Dzogchen and Mahamudra? And basically they're not talking about Dzogchen and Mahamudra, but it's become so popularized that people think they know what it is. And if you do that, you're not going to get anywhere. And also, like I say, it's generally only ever done in retreat. Is that because it's kind of exclusive? No. It's because you have to, while you're going through this process of guidance with your teacher, it's the same in the Zen tradition, you've got to be meditating 8-12 hours a day. The teacher will see you for hopefully not too long, it's like 15 minutes, and ask you about questions about your meditation, and then they'll give you a doubt, and you'll go into meditation, you'll spend the rest of the day, 16 hours, 18 hours, just thinking about that, and you'll come back the next day and you've got something else to say. And it's essential, because it needs that intensity, and it's not something you're going to get just by following a few techniques online. You'll never get there. You're not going to stumble upon it yourself either. It's like the way my teacher said, it's like some people, they sit and meditating, they're waiting for something to like drop out of the sky and say, oh, that's the true nature of mind. What advice would you give to a person, and what questions would you want to ask him to ask himself if he wants to become a monk? Yeah, my advice if you want to become a monk or a nun is to think about it really, really well, and think about what your reasons are. This is anonymous from Nepal. I think I know who this is, actually. So the inception, the impetus for becoming a monk is what's called renunciation. It's basically you turn away from the mundane world and have this commitment that you are not interested in anything else other than liberation. And you need that to be an authentic monk. But there are other authentic reasons to become a monk. One is called seeking protection from fear. But it doesn't really happen these days anymore. In the past, if somebody was like an orphan, or if they were like an orphan girl especially, and they didn't want to die as a beggar in the street, then they would go to the monastery. And this is called giving protection from fear. And it's seen as actually being a valid reason for engaging in the vows and discipline, because somebody who has that level of suffering will kind of understand really what the path is all about. It's about transcending suffering. So they'll already have even if they don't realize it themselves, they'll already have a really good foundation for practice. So, that's a reason. Also, seeking better rebirth next time round is a valid reason for becoming a monk. But ultimately, the real reason is to gain liberation, to escape samsara. So you should think about it really well, and you should study. It's not something you should take lightly. Too many people do. And there's not much point if you sort of make that commitment and then later on you think, well, it's not for me. It's kind of all about leaving mundane world behind, including your family, etc. And it's not essential either on the path, especially these days, because it's very difficult for us really to tread the path authentically anyway. And there's very few people these days who can authentically keep the vows. If you do have an opportunity, then I think you should go for it, but you should definitely consider it, and you should primarily consider whether you have renunciation. You should also consider, do I believe in liberation? Do I believe in karma, cause and effect? Do I believe in past and future lives? And you have to have very firm faith in this, because otherwise the basis for you wanting to do that is mistaken. And like I say, for us Westerners, we're not in the situation where we think, well, I have to become a monk because otherwise I'm going to starve to death, because we get social services and things like that, right? So, and also if you're, I think I know who this person is, if you're a young person, then you also have to have permission, you have to have the blessing of your family. There's all kinds of stipulations in the Vinaya. One of them, for example, is if there's a war, if your country is attacked, and you're going to be called up to service, you're not allowed to run away and become a monk. You're supposed to use that as an excuse to get out of military service. If you have debts and commitments, and also if you're young, then you have to have the blessing of your family. Snow from USA. Hello, Snow. When somebody says another person is an emanation of a deity or something like that, what do they mean? Usually it's kind of flattery. Many people say this of their teachers. What happens often in Tibetan Buddhism, historically, is that they'll have some significant person who has amazing qualities. For example, there's somebody, they're asking about Thangtong Gyalpo here, and they'll say, oh, well, he must be a reincarnation of so-and-so, because they're just so amazing, right? They have this sort of they're like geniuses, etc., prodigies. So often it's a form of praise, let's say. Also, it's sometimes used as a kind of validation, a lineage validation. So if they have a reincarnate Lama, and then they want to validate them, they will say, well, they're the reincarnation of this person or that person. And you get into trouble with this because you find like multiple reincarnations of the same individual. It is possible for somebody to individualize more than one body. That has been kind of accepted in Tibetan Buddhism for centuries. I don't know when the earliest example of this is, but it's probably 1,000 years or more. So that is possible. But in general, then there's a lot of people who claim to be emanations who probably are mistaken identifications. And then if you hear Westerners say this, it's usually because they come to Tibetan Buddhism and they get kind of like just wrapped up in the whole culture of the thing, and so they'll say this very loosely. It's not something that should be done loosely, and in general it should be somebody with like special powers in terms of their realization or really high level of meditation, and then they'll be able to sort of identify who's an emanation of who. But you have to understand that this system has been abused, and it's also been kind of turned into a custom in Tibet. For example, there's emanations who are seen to be, they're like lineage holders, so they need that person to be the emanation of somebody else, and they have to have a continuous lineage. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of avoids nepotism. So the tendency would be to want to like give the lineage over to somebody in your family, or somebody who's like a friend of yours, right, to keep it in the family. And so part of this Toku system is, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it breaks down this tendency. So they usually, for example, the Dalai Lama, the Karmapa, they'll find a reincarnation who is born somewhere far away, and they're usually nobody who's really impoverished. Because otherwise what happens is, because human tendencies, for example, the Chinese want to make their own emanations. They've got kind of ulterior motives. So because of human tendencies, then they'll try to make like the sister of that Lama who died their son. Make them like nepotism, right? Make them into the... So part of that emanation system is to carry a lineage, spiritual lineage, but they also had honorific tukus. So, for example, Chime Rinpoche is an example of this. Many people think, oh, Chime is an enlightened reincarnation master, but he wasn't. He was the son of a village headman in Tibet. And because the village headman had a lot of power and money, he used to donate to the monastery. So the monastery would make an honorific kind of tuku, make him into a tuku, but it was an honorific position. So in the Gelugpa tradition, then they have tukus as well, but they mostly, what they venerate most of all is learning. And so they have tukus, but in general the tukus are not given much respect. They're seen as being, well, they're never going to be a good student because they're kind of too spoiled. And so they don't have very high status. So the head of the Gelugpa lineage is not a reincarnate tuku. The head of Gelugpa lineage is anybody. There's a saying, it's like any woman's son can become the holder of the throne. So there's somebody called the Ganden Trippa. Trippa is a throne. So it's the throne of the Ganden monastery. And basically anybody can work their way up through the ranks if they're smart enough. And it's done by whoever gets the best marks, basically. And not who's like the son of who's famous, or powerful lord. So that's all the kind of pejorative side, right? They want to preserve the lineage. It's quite a good system, really. There's many things I could say about that. And then there's this side where they give out tukus honorifically to people who have made donations to the monastery, or because they also they might give a tuku to like a local bandit because they don't want to be robbed. So that doesn't sound very good, right? But if you follow the what it teaches in the Buddha Dharma, then we're all reincarnations. We're all tukus. So we're all, it's like, what was I the reincarnation of? Sometimes I think, I must have been the reincarnation of a plumber or an electrician or something like that, right? But we're all reincarnations. But the idea is that somebody with really high level of practice then gains the ability to choose where they're going to be reborn. So this is really the pure meaning of tuku. And also with this, what you have to understand is that this just shows how very rare an authentic tuku is. So an authentic tuku will be somebody who has such amazing meditation, let's say Milarepa or something, and then they can choose to be reborn as anything they like. They can be a poor person, a rich person, and they will choose to be reborn with a particular intention. So I think many of the, like the Dalai Lama and many of these high lamas who have got a very high level of meditation, then they intentionally choose to be born as beggar children in poor families in the middle of nowhere, so that there's no chance of corruption in their lineage. And I do believe this is the case, that this does happen. But I think our perspective is very warped, because we get this impression that there's just loads of these kind of incarnate lamas, the ones who choose to be reborn. But there's basically a lot of fakes. There's a lot of honorific tukus. There's a lot of tukus who they just need to find somebody to replace the previous guy. But there are amazing practitioners who willfully reincarnate, and they're special beings, but they're very, very rare. The guy who did that book on reincarnation, Ian Stevenson, well, one of his students carried on his work, and he was a student of Ling Rinpoche, I believe, and he was a scientist, but he was a Buddhist. And he was kind of this position, well, I have great faith in Buddhism, I think it's great, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, but I'm a scientist and I just can't believe in reincarnation because there's no empirical evidence. He was very clear about that in his own mind. And then he went to, he'd been a student of Ling Rinpoche, I believe it was Ling Rinpoche. Ling Rinpoche is a tutor of Dalai Lama, by the way. They reincarnate, they teach them, and then they die, and then the next lifetime they teach them again, right? So often the mentor will have known the previous Dalai Lama, and then when the baby is born, that mentor continues on teaching that baby, and then that mentor dies and is reborn, and so on and so forth, right? So there's this Ling Rinpoche. Everybody says Ling Rinpoche is an amazing Lama, and very learned and very realized and with loads of experience. And so he was a student of this Lama, and the Lama died. And then he came back to India at one point, and he met the reincarnation. And he was always a skeptic, he was always a scientist, he didn't believe really in the stories. And then he met this little boy, and he was just blown away. It was like, I think the way he put it was like, I just couldn't believe it. It was the same person. And you get this quite often. I think like for example, the 16th Karmapa, there's many, many stories. But the ones who do it like that, who are really authentic, are very, very rare. So when somebody says another person is an emanation of a deity or something like that, so when they say they're a tuku, this is what I've just explained, if you'll hear, for example, Dalai Lama is a tuku, right, a reincarnation, but they say Dalai Lama is an emanation of Chen Rezik. So the Tibetans believe that Dalai Lama is an emanation of this Yidam deity Chenrezig, which is the Lord of Love. It's a bodhisattva who is the bodhisattva of loving, limitless loving compassion. And so the Tibetans actually believe that the Dalai Lama is a Buddha, not all of them obviously, but it's very, very strong. And specifically an emanation of a particular deity, Chenrezig, who's limitless loving compassion. And so what this means is that they embody all of those qualities. Because really, what many of these deities are is they're representations of, for example, enlightened qualities. What are enlightened qualities? They're like exponential magnifications of the best human qualities. Like we have worldly love and compassion, and then some human beings have this kind of special love and compassion. They're very selfless, but if you extrapolate that ad infinitum, what is the most selfless, the most compassionate, the most loving that anybody can be, and then we embody that as Chenrezig. And so they kind of epitomize, embody those qualities. And so again, often this is done as a form of praise, but also people believe this to be true. And most Tibetans believe that Dalai Lama is an emanation of Chenrezig. But Dalai Lama himself says, for example, well, I'm just an ordinary person on the path of accumulation. He's very specific of where he is on the path. He says, I'm not a Buddha, I'm not enlightened, but I'm on the path of accumulation. But all of his students, for the most part, do think he is a Buddha. Can you explain about Buddhism among the young people, especially in Westernized mindset? Explain how Buddhism can help the young generation in the future. Vajrapane Art from USA. Yeah, traditionally what's happened is that we've had very few young people in Buddhism in the last maybe 40 years. There was a time, for example, when Sam Harris was probably young and traveling in Asia, when there were quite a few young, enthusiastic people. Around Trungpa's time, there was all the hippies, and they were quite young, enthusiastic. And then recently there's been this trend where basically all those students who were young are just getting older and older and older and older, and many of them now have died, and they're in their 80s and their 90s. But I noticed recently, very recently, more young people coming. And I don't know if this has just got to do with my experience as a teacher, right? What I mean by that is I've done some retreats recently, and I've got students that I speak to online on Zoom, and I'm surprised because many of them are actually very young. Some of them are only like 18 or 20. And when we did our spring retreat last year, there was some of this older generation, these two people from Europe who had been involved with Buddhism for many years, and they were, 60 kind of age. And when we did our retreat, they were saying, I just have to say something. I have to say I'm really, really impressed to see so many young people here. So I've seen a lot of young people. And so I can talk about them. And they seem to be kind of fed up, really, with what the world is offering them. And because of this, then they're attracted to Buddhism. And many of them, for example, are they're Christians. They come from Christian families, had a Christian upbringing. And also many of them aren't like the old guard, these older people I'm talking about who died a long time ago. They're kind of people who had some kind of connection with Vajrayana Buddhism since the age of Trungpa, etc. And they've got a very different take than these young people, because these young people I've met basically don't know anything about Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism. They're completely fresh and new. And also they're not like meeting the 16th Karmapa and Dudjom Rinpoche like in the 70s and stuff when these Tibetans came, all these amazing old lamas. They don't have access to those kind of lamas. And they're kind of doing their own research online and contacting people like me, right? Trying to get more information. And the general feeling I get is that they feel that there isn't a place for them in the world. That the world is so incredibly materialistic. And also most of the ones I've spoken to feel like they're not like their peers. Their peers are very much, have a different kind of mentality. They're interested in very different things. So, but there are issues here because there are basically a lot of things within Buddhism that are completely counterintuitive to the modern narrative in the developed world, the Western world. And so because of that, I think many of these young people who are interested in Buddhism are confused and also are feeling a lot of dissonance. We've got a lot of dissonant feelings about the Buddha Dharma. So on one side, they're hearing these kind of sensational stories about Tibetan Lamas misbehaving, getting in trouble, being taken to court, paternity suits. On the other hand, they're really attracted to all these philosophical and spiritual aspects they hear about Buddhism. And so they're left kind of confused. And I think this is a kind of very indicative of the basic state of affairs in general for young people. And I mean everybody, but especially for them. Because their main form of networking is over like social media, etc. And they spend a lot of time on these platforms. And there's a lot of contradictory information about everything. It's like this geopolitics as much as it is about the spiritual path. And there's so much disinformation. And I think that's why they reach out to me. Because I say some controversial things, I use some modern terminology, shitposting for Buddha and stuff like that. And so then they think they can maybe gain some insight. But what I find, my general experience is that they have a lot of frustration. They really are drawn to Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, but at the same time they're very fearful about a lot of things. And there's a lot of mistrust, but this is in general now for young kids. Nobody knows who to trust, right? Everybody's like totally polarized. So one group of people saying one thing, other people saying another thing. It's like there's two separate realities. And so that's very difficult, I think. Now, I think what role can this play for the younger generation in the future? Well, I think it can play a very significant role. And I really hope that many, many, many more young people get an interest in the spiritual path, because the alternative for them is just totally grim. The world has become so incredibly materialistic, and it's completely counter the spiritual path. And the future of our world is not going to be a pleasant place if we fall into even greater nihilism. I think that's basically what it is. We've become incredibly nihilistic, and the way that populist politicians play the game is to make the world even more nihilistic. Because the more nihilistic people they are, then the more apathetic they will be. And then they'll just be distracted, right? They'll be easily controlled, and they'll be distracted by glitzy iPhones and stupid stories on TikTok, etc. It's amazing, actually. I was looking online, and so much now is generated by AI, and it's just bullshit. And it's not even things that are intentionally trying to deceive people, like all this sort of right-wing, white supremacist propaganda that's being spouted everywhere, which is, of course, very dangerous. But there's all this other stuff. It's just like cultural stuff that's just generated by AI. Fictitious meetings from people who'd never met. And so now what it's called is the post-truth era, right? Buddhism is about the ultimate truth, and what we live in is the post-truth era. So this is what we call in the 5 degradations, the degradation of view, right? Where people see black to be white, good to be bad. That's where we are. And so my feeling is that if some young people get involved in Buddhism now and they practice, then in 50 years, there's going to be some very healthy, very helpful people who can, spiritually heal this world. But it's a really difficult task. Really, the future is in the young. And in the next 10 years, we're going to see one of the greatest changes in human history. That's because all of the baby boomers are dying. And there'll be the biggest transfer of wealth the world has ever known. And also there'll be a massive change. So you watch out for that. I probably won't be around that much longer. But it's hard to imagine what the future is going to be like. So Paul from Scotland asked, do you know of Thangtong Gyalpo, the bridge builder? If so, could you share some stories, etc.? He's interested because he used to work with stainless steel, and Thangtong Gyalpo famously built a lot of bridges in Tibet and Bhutan. So really, you can read some stuff on Wikipedia, and all this sort of stuff, but I'll just make a general comment here. And that is, Thangtong Gyalpo is somebody we call a siddha. So you've got people who've got special powers. I was talking about this earlier, actually. We've got these tulkus, right? And some are just beings that seem to have special powers, special abilities, like geniuses. And then when people encounter them, especially in Tibet, then they try to attribute that to a previous incarnation. And so Thangtong Gyalpo is associated with Golat Sawa and Guru Rinpoche. Some people say he was a reincarnation of Guru Rinpoche, etc., or previous past masters and siddhas. And it's because he seemed to have great ability and talent from a young age. That book I just referenced earlier from Ian Stevenson talks about reincarnation, and so this is really important. Also, when I was talking about tulkus, remember, they sort of practice in one lifetime, and then they gain very special meditative powers, and through those then they have special abilities. For example, you know, the young tulkus, they can pick up a text, one of these big thick texts, they look at it once and they've memorized it. And that's because over many, many lifetimes they've memorized that text. So it only takes like one read through to trigger their memory. And so Thangtong Gyalpo was a siddha, and he was one of these kind of individuals. His story is that when he was born 14th century or something like that, end of 14th century, 1370, I think. And what they said was that when he was born, then he immediately attained a 60-year-old's body. But I think this has probably got more to do with somebody having, you know, what we call precocious children, right? Who are like, seem to be much more advanced than their ages. So he was basically born as a genius. When you see pictures of him, then he's always depicted with long white hair. So this is kind of associated with wisdom and his ability. He was an engineer, like he was an autodidact, you know, like these people like Elon Musk, they call them autodidacts. They teach themselves everything and they learn things very quickly. He was one of those individuals. But the interesting thing is that the siddhas in general, these kind of special practitioners, reincarnate beings, then what they tend to do is they tend to have great meditation, but on the outside it looks like they don't give up worldly activities. So in the case of Tilopa, then he used to grind sesame seeds, right? He was like, did some peasant work. And all of the siddhas are the same. They might be like a buffalo herder. And it looks like they're not practicing. This is an important point because it's all about Mudra and the Dzogchen. So in the Mudra and Dzogchen, then what's taught is you don't need some sort of special practice. And there's an important point here, an experiential point here about meditation that's being made. It's kind of a metaphor, right? It's a spiritual metaphor. It's like any activity can be meditation. And so the siddhas then, they overtly, then they applied themselves to what seemed to be totally worldly activities, and at the same time gained great realization. And what Thangtong Gyalpo did was he built bridges and monasteries. In fact, he dreamed up suspension bridges, like invented suspension bridges made out of iron, and he built them. And apparently many of these bridges still exist because they were built so well. He developed a system of forging iron so that it did not rot, for example. And anyway, the interesting thing is that all the siddhas were like this, basically engaged in what seemed to be worldly activities, and at the same time seemed to have an amazing spiritual life. But then these are special individuals, and I totally believe in this. I mean, there's the son of the Bhutanese king who recently, well, not that recently, went to Tibet because he remembered he was Vikramasila, which is the abbot of this Samyeling monastery in Tibet. And so he, from a very, very young age, and he developed this desire to revisit his old meditation caves. And of course, being the king of Bhutan, they have their own airplane, and they flew him there. And there's a documentary that follows him around. And he just knew in such great detail about the entire life of his previous, lifetime many, many years ago. And he could say where secret meditation caves were. He could talk about his life. And when he talks about his life, then tears would well up in his eyes. But he was very, very young, right? There was just too much information there for him even to be taught in a sort of covert manner. And there are kind of many examples of this throughout history. But again, I think that these really significant practitioners are quite rare. But what you have to remember is that we're all reincarnations. We all go from lifetime to lifetime. And the important thing is that we apply ourselves in this lifetime as best we can. Because then it's like, next lifetime it's a bit better, next lifetime it's a bit better. If you want to end up being like one of these amazing figures like Thangtong Gyalpo, who was a spiritual practitioner and also had amazing worldly knowledge, was so capable, then what you have to do is apply yourself. And eventually you will get there. And then at some time 500 years ago, 500 years from now, you'll look back on your previous lives and a tear will come to your eye. Travis from the United States of America says, if I believe that the Theravada path is for me, but the only Sangha physically available to me is a Zen center, should I just go anyways? Well, no. If you believe the Theravada path is the right path for you, then there are many opportunities. And if you go to your local Zen center, that's got nothing to do with becoming a Theravada monk and leading and following the Theravada path. They're really very different. There's similarities, but it's very different. And I would say that if you're in the States, right, so you've got loads of opportunities. If you're going to follow the Theravada path, I mean the Theravada path of the monastic, I presume that's what you're talking about, because if you're talking about the Theravada path as a layperson, that's a very different thing. But you've got various different organizations who offer a valid path to practice this as a mendicant. One of them is Plum Village, that's Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition. And I know it's associated with Zen meditation, but they have a monastic path, so you can take full ordination, and it's quite authentic. And their centers they have all the infrastructure, and they have a program, a 5-year program, where you follow that, and you can become a fully ordained monastic, and you will live according to the rules. And if you're specifically talking about Theravada as it exists in Sri Lanka and Burma, then there is and Thailand, then there's the Ajahn Chah organization. They have monasteries all over the world, and they're really authentic. So there's opportunities. And it's not like go to my local Zen center is implying that you're going to stay in your normal life as it is now. If you really want to follow the Theravada path is one of renouncing the world and giving up your home and your family and going forth, which means becoming a mendicant and just forgetting the mundane world and practicing. And if you're going to do that, it doesn't matter. You can go anywhere. You can go to Sri Lanka. You can go to Burma. I know many people who've done that. There's a guy, a French-Canadian guy, he took ordination in 1979. He spent years in Burma and Sri Lanka. I just interviewed Beth Upton. She spent 10 years as a nun. If you're really that serious, then there's opportunities. But in general, most local centers aren't up to much. They're doing their best, but you're not going to gain an authentic practice just by going to your local center. Even if you weren't interested in the Theravada path, but you wanted to study Tibetan Buddhism, well, if you go to your local center, they're going to do puja 3 times a week. And they might do a Losar celebration. And occasionally somebody will come and teach. That's not the path. These places are essentially the kind of places where they sell incense and they do weekend meditation retreats. It's a way of connecting with the Dharma, but it's not, if you're serious about the path, then, for example, if it was Tibetan Buddhism, you'd go to Nepal and go join a monastery. So there's opportunity if you really on the path. If you've just got a kind of cultural hobby interest in Buddhism, well, it doesn't matter where you go. Just meditate, go to a local yoga studio and meditate. But if you want to go into retreat, if you want to become ordained, there are opportunities. They're there. People don't see them because most people aren't that serious. It's like, I really want to follow the Theravada path, but I don't want to give up my girlfriend, I don't want to give up my job, I don't want to give up my life. I want to do it on the side. Well, you can't. You can't follow that path and do it on the side. but it's perfectly fine if you want to do it on the side. If you want to do meditation on the side, if you like to do a bit of shamatha, if you want to practice mindfulness, then sure, go to your local Zen center. It's all much the same, right? If you're just doing a bit of shine or meditating on a candle, then there's not much difference between where you go. And that's all you will get in most centers. And the better centers, you'll get an education. They'll do teachings, but it won't be continual. It will be, once a month or a few times a year. Tony from the United States, that was Travis from the United States. Tony from the United States, Thich Nhat Hanh says, our true nature is the nature of no birth and no death. However, Buddhism really emphasizes suffering, especially aging, sickness, and death. Yeah, Thich Nhat Hanh's presentation is not non-Buddhist. It's the exact same presentation. But this is this no birth, no death is associated with Zen tradition, Zen Buddhism. So Vietnamese Buddhism, you have to understand, is a mixture of Theravadic Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. So in the north, it's Zen. In the south, it's like the traditional kind of yellow robe Theravadic. But because of that, there's a crossover in a mix. So there's many aspects in each side. But this thing about no birth and no death, or achieving deathlessness, is a Zen idea. And that is basically when you realize primordial when you realize primordial wisdom through your meditation, then you achieve a state which is called deathlessness. But that's not separate from the teachings on suffering, aging, sickness, and death, for example. The teachings on aging, suffering, aging, sickness, and death, the principal sufferings of the human realm, are the foundation of the Zen tradition. They're the foundation of the Vajrayana tradition. It's the same. It starts off with renunciation. On top of that, then you add bodhicitta, loving kindness, compassion. Then on top of that, you add pure view. But it's a pyramid, right? If you can't build a pyramid if you remove the foundation. The foundation of all Buddhism is first, what the Buddha taught? First, recognize suffering. That's the same. If you go to Zen temple, the Buddha taught, first, recognize suffering. If you go to Vajrayana temple, the Buddha taught, first, recognize suffering. So they're not different. You just misunderstood what's being taught. Anonymous from South Africa, in Buddhism's sense of knowing. In Buddhism's sense of knowing is achieving a Buddha state referring to the transcendence from materiality into immateriality. No, I can say no, it's not that. Or your own causal active existence here into a state of possible non-existence with reality. No, it's not a nihilistic approach. It's not about eliminating anything or getting rid of anything or others such to it referring to its referring of structurality. I don't know what that means, but and others such to its referring of structurality. Well, that doesn't make sense. But this idea that for example, there's the material world, and then we need to remove that and achieve an immaterial world. This isn't really Buddhist talk, the way this is presented. It sounds more like a mixture of kind of Hindu ideas. But you have to understand that the Buddhist view is the view that is free of the two extremes. And those two extremes are the extremes of permanence or existence and nihilism or non-existence. So these are both refuted. What we're talking about is a middle way between these two. And that is the true nature of phenomena. And so it's not about removing or eliminating anything. It's not about the denial of materialism or materiality. It's not of entering a spirit world, for example. In fact, if you look at the foundational vehicle, the Theravada, then they divide the world into two things, matter and mind. And clinging to either of these is seen to be a problem, equally. So it's not about going from materiality into a mental world, abandoning materiality for mental world. Both the non-compactness of the material world and the mental world need to be recognized. So that means recognizing that the material world is just an aggregation of atoms. And because of that, it's impermanent and it's ephemeral. And likewise, the mental world is an aggregation of time moments. It's a bunch of time moments coming together, and it doesn't have any personal identity. It is impermanent, and it's the nature of suffering. So Anyway, it's a big topic. So Alex from Spain, does compassion require to feel the suffering of the one who suffers? No. But really great Mahayana practitioners can do this. So Maitreya Yoga is the example of this. Maitreya Yogi then famously was teaching on a throne, teaching the Buddha Dharma, and then suddenly he kind of like fell off his throne quite dramatically. And people said, what had happened? And he said, I saw a dog over there and somebody threw a stone at it. So I took the pain that dog experienced onto myself. So we do talk about this, but it's not necessary. In general, what we do is we use kind of narratives. The narrative that we use primarily is something called the 7 Points Mind Training. But it's a way of developing empathy for others. But it's primarily, it's focused on all sentient beings, but it arises from seeing the suffering of others. It doesn't arise from actually experiencing their suffering. And so we can do this. We can just look on YouTube. We can see everything that's going on in the world and think, oh, those poor people, and give rise to compassion. It's sort of, it doesn't have to be actual empathy where we experience their pain. If you can do that, it's actually quite a useful thing. It's generally seen to be very useful to have empathy, but my experience is that people who are empaths often experience obstacles. They experience obstacles because they tend to get overwhelmed by the feelings that they can feel other people suffering, right? So they get overwhelmed by that. And that's really common. I'd say almost everybody I know is an empath. Then they have that obstacle to their practice because they get overwhelmed by the emotions. And Alex from Spain also asked another question. Can karma operate on the external circumstances of your life? For example, causing a bridge to collapse while you are crossing it, or does karma operate only through your mental states and qualities? Thank you very much for your time. Yeah, so yes, of course. It acts on the external physical world. But you have to think about it a little bit in terms of the level of philosophy before you can understand what that means. Because in the Yogacarya and upwards, all of the higher levels of the Buddhist school of thinking, philosophy, then what is taught is that the world we experience is a projection. It's much like a dream. So we habituate ourselves. Karma is about habituating ourselves. We habituate ourselves to a way of thinking, and then we project that on the world. So the bridge collapsing is a projection of mind. So in that Yogacarya, then it's not actually acting on the external world, but we perceive it as acting on the external world. But even in the foundational vehicles, the foundational levels of teaching, the Buddha Dharma, then they say that your karma creates where you're going to be reborn, what you experience. And so that experience is one that's created from your karma. So it's dependent upon the mental world. But yes, the short answer is yes, it can act on external circumstances of your life. Of course it does. Even disease, a virus coming at you. Not only that, think about it this way. If you kill somebody in a past lifetime, then they might come back as a disease to kill you. Or you might encounter a wild animal. So these are external things, right? But there's a causal link. That's the important thing. Could you speak a little about the practice of mantra recitation, its significance on the path? Could you talk a little bit about Om Mani Padme Hung? Thank you very much. Alex from Spain. So Om Mani Padme Hung is the mantra of Chenrezig, this deity I was talking about, who is the kind of embodiment of ultimate love and compassion, limitless love and compassion for all beings. And essentially, in terms of the Buddhist view, then this wish to benefit beings is not based on a materialistic view. For example, it's not based on the notion that I need to give them food and wealth and clothing to make them happy. It's based on the idea that we suffer because of our ignorance. So the way to help beings is to teach them the Dharma so that they can practice, and through their practice they can overcome their kleshas, and when they eliminate the kleshas, then they can achieve liberation from samsara. So it's not about like giving them things or talking to them nicely or giving them medicine, that sort of thing. And so we say this Om Mani Padme Hung mantra, and essentially what that means is, may all beings achieve awakening. It's this wish that all beings achieve awakening, because awakening, Buddhahood, is what will bring lasting, permanent peace and happiness to oneself and others. And when it comes to the mantra recitation, then it sounds a little bit like kind of magical spells. Like you repeat something over and over again. Om Mani Padme Hung, Om Mani Padme. We do this. Om Mani Padme Hung, Om Mani Padme Hung, Om Mani Padme Hung, Om Mani Padme Hung. It's like we have got some magical power in our voice. And that's very much how it seems. But the Buddha taught the importance of mantra recitation. And really, again, you have to look at the different levels of view. But what we're doing is a powerful way of habituating ourselves. So in general, there's taught to be 3 gates of virtue: body, speech, and mind. And within a mantra recitation, there's actually all 3 of these. But the speech element is very important. For example, if you go out with your mates, you go to the pub and you spend all your time talking about football or women or something like that, right? And then you go back home and you try to meditate, then that's just going to keep coming up. Whatever you're talking about will come up in your mind. It might even come up in your dreams, right? And so what we do with mantra recitation is we take something virtuous like, may all beings be free of suffering, may all beings be free of suffering. And then we have the verbal aspect, which is saying the words. That's a verbal virtue. We have the physical aspect of the repetitions. Sometimes we do these mantras with prostrations, so it's physical repetitions. And then we've got the meaning of that. And associated with the meaning might be, for example, with Om Mani Padme Hung, is a visualization of Chenrezig. So we're creating a visual world. We're creating this mandala of Chenrezig in our mind, which has specific visual elements. We're saying the mantra, which is verbal, and also the meaning, which is mental, and we're doing physical actions. We're doing mudras, we're turning the mala, ringing bells, making offerings, etc. So it's really what it is. It's a synthesis of all of our gates of virtue, body, speech, and mind. So what we do is we take the creative power of the mind, and then we take the power of speech and physical form to habituate ourselves very strongly to 2 things, to virtue and to the view. So the view can be the view of emptiness, it can be the view of loving kindness, compassion, it can be the view of Dzogchen Mao Mudra, whatever that is. And by synthesizing all of those things into one powerful virtuous force, then there's this potential for great transformation. And so in a nutshell, that's what mantra practice is about. So anyway, we've come to the end of our time. We've got to number 93. Oh dear, there's another 119. We've still got up to 119, but I'll do my best in order to get through these things as quickly as I can. But at the end, let's just try to offer the merit, dedicate the merit of anything positive that's come out of this conversation to the benefit of others. Also, especially to help alleviate the great deal of suffering that many people are experiencing in the world these days. I mean, America's just started bombing Venezuela. You know, we're just going back to the dark ages, it seems, so quickly. And there's so many people suffering. It's not just, for example, the poor people of Gaza who are getting bombs dropped on their head, but it's also everybody else who's like a spectator in this charade. And, you know, this period that we're going through is something that's quite difficult to tolerate. But when we say dedicate the merit, really what we're doing is we're deepening our own spiritual practice. Because in the long run, this is what's going to benefit others. In the long run, we're not going to transform the world overnight, but if we apply ourselves to our spiritual practice and deepen that, then there's a potential that we will be able to influence others and influence the outcome of the world. And so it's incredibly important. In fact, the Buddha taught that this is the most important thing that we can do. So anyway, thank you for joining us. Again, have a happy new year. And until next time, see you later.